Interest session in honor of Harry M. Trebing, who you can see on the couch there. He's gracing us from Fairfax, Virginia. Along with Harry is Bill Melody in Virginia. The order will be first Rodney Stevenson, then Bill Melody, then David Gable, then Ken Rose, then me, Bob Loeb. I'll go last. That'll give me an incentive to stop people so that I'll have some time to talk. And we can easily stop Bill. All we have to do is turn this thing off. So that'll get rid of him. Yeah, it'll be the first time I've ever shut Bill Melody off. So anyhow, Rodney, put your phone down and let's get started. I will raise a sign when you have 5 minutes left.
Okay. There are, for those of you like me who are stuck in the past and still think paper matters, there are copies of paper here. So at some point feel free. Harry, hi. It's been far too long. The story we're going to tell here is an old story. In the States, back during the Federalist periods, it was said that money and power are not long parted. In the late 1800s, Mark Hanna and the Trust, in these days, Citizen United, power and the impact upon society and the lack of impact society on power is a long story. It's a story that Harry has been involved with deeply. Involved with in terms of the public utilities. Now, let me mention a statement from his major professor. Harry was mine, for which I'm eternally thankful. Public utilities are closely associated with our conception of civilization. The public interest manifests chiefly in the connection with those functions which preserve civilized life and which prevent it from coming, as Hobbes said, solitary, brutish, and nasty. Harry, trained at the University of Wisconsin when it was a bastion of institutionalism, went on to earn his right and the society's right and economist right among the first echelon of those who were concerned with the social control of industry and the control of power. He follows in the tradition of those who have been essential in these areas, including John R. Commons, Martin Glaser, Richard T. Ely, J.M. Clark, and also Brondbright and his teacher at the University of Maryland, Eli Clemmings. His work as an institutionalist was clear in the best of the institutionalist tradition. Holistic, knowing that you can't know the whole if you don't know the parts, and you can't know the parts unless you know the whole. Harry was very adept at Veblen-esque commentary. He could speak with a keen-edged perspective. But the tradition that he followed was the tradition of John R. Commons, of bringing together theory with deep involvement in institutional processes, and particularly the processes of public utility regulation. And it is knowing those processes, knowing who the players were, what the interests were, knowing all of the ins and outs of the various bits and pieces that he both had and could reinforce and put those in context of the social control of enterprise and what the nature of public utilities are. I want to say just a few words about public utilities to set the context, because what I really want to talk about is that public utilities and regulation is not a phenomena of the last several years. It's not merely an issue of natural monopoly and the efforts to try to maximize consumer surplus. The root goes back far, far beyond that. Public utilities are quasi-public in nature, that lie in between those functions that are clearly public but not separable in terms of provision and those that are clearly private. They are functions that are public in nature, but their provisions can be segregated and provided on a fee basis. What are the two major aspects? One of the aspects is power, the control of access to those goods and services that are necessary. And where does that power come from? Well, it comes in part from the technology, what we view as the various economies of scale, economies of density, economies of diversification, and the like. And it comes from the ability to control those essential aspects to be able to get to the services that are needed. The other aspect, necessity. We're not talking about goods which are nice to have. We're not talking about things that are pleasant to do. It's always nice to go to a good movie. It's always nice to go to a good restaurant. It's always nice to have new foods. But those aren't necessary. What we're talking about are things that are necessary to the quality of our life. Things that are necessary by virtue of biological needs. You know, try getting by without drinking water for a while. Well, you drink beer. But in order to get to there, you need water. Are things that are necessary by adaptation. A lot of our necessities today come from our adaptation to new technologies. Imagine life without electricity. Imagine, how many of you have a cell phone? Yeah? How many of you, when you're going around, watch the number of people, whether you're at a restaurant, whether you're in the waiting room of the doctors, whether you're on the plane, how many people have their cell phones out? Large number. What would it be like if those weren't here today? We have grown to depend upon them. We have grown to depend upon sources of energy for heat, for light. And increasingly, we are growing to depend upon interconnectivity, access to the internet for our well-being as individuals, our well-being as a society. These are essential needs that have come from adaptation to the new technologies. And the ability to control those is of central importance for not only the well-being of individuals, but for the well-being of society as a whole. Now, in terms of the public utilities, we're not talking about anything which is new. We're not talking about something that has gone back for centuries. We're talking about something that has gone back for millennia. I don't know if any of you have Martin Glazer's book, two really important books, one which Harry had a very important role in writing. But Glazer did an incredible job from his German historical tradition of going back and tracking over time through millennia those sorts of goods and services that are public in nature. From the water systems in ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Rome, to the development of systems in Rome. There was this canal that carried all of the sewage and all of the stormwater to the Tiber River. Nobody cared particularly what was happening to the Tiber River, but it was a centralized system that assured, improved, and ensured the health and well-being of those that were there. A necessary system, what is called a public utility. Over time, a lot of things have been viewed as public utilities. What we view as a public utility, today we view it as telecommunications, as electric power, as natural gas distribution, are only a part of the story, because they cover only a part of the necessities. And because the provision of them involves, in one way or another, power from the standpoint of the provider. Again, there has been a fiction that has been placed upon us in the last few years that public utilities end at the end of natural monopolies. Agape, is that a public utility? Well, there are two. How can it be? 2, 3, 4 providers? Is that a public utility? Well, it's not a natural monopoly. There are concentrating aspects of the technology, but we forget over time that really the nature of public utility extended far beyond what we view today. And in forgetting that, we forget the need for the public to be actively involved in the provision of those services, not involved simply as a traffic cop, setting the rules for what you can and cannot do, setting the standards are for what's the heat content for natural gas, so on and so forth, not as a mediator or arbitrator, which is balancing the interest of the various parties that are involved, but as one that is actively involved in directing the growth and development of public utility services, providing voice not only to those who can speak loudly, but to those whose voice is very weak. How many of us really listen to the poor? Are those for whose voice has not yet manifested, those who exist in the future. Not traffic cop, not arbiter or mediator, but something that is far more important, that extends far beyond that, for the assurance and development of necessary services and provisions of necessary services. Utilities have gone back a long, long time. Now, in terms of that, if you look at some of the public utility concept, how many of you are treated in the public utility concept? Yeah, just price, non-discrimination, reciprocal responsibility or status. Started with St. Augustine, who was very concerned with the issue, well, to put it in modern terms, that we are not free to choose for public goods or those things that are necessary. We are forced to choose. Now, the market can do good things. Indeed, the market can be relied upon, at least in part, to move toward socially desired results, as long as there aren't externalities and as long as people have the right to choose. What's the right to choose? Well, I either buy or I won't buy. And if I don't buy, my own well-being has not declined. What is it for the utilities? Well, you've heard, give me your money or give me your life. That's sort of an extreme view of it. But it's a choice that says, unless you buy, you're going to suffer. Now, something that is less extreme with that, the cost is in your life just an arm and a leg. Unless you provide that which require as recompense for service that is rendered, you're going to be worse off. You do not have the right to not choose and not incur harm or damage to yourself and harm or damage to society as a whole. It's not a new problem. It's not a new concern. It goes way, way, way back. What did St. Augustine do? Anybody? Where did the concept of just price come from? It came from there. He and the church fathers were talking about 350 CE, current era, came up with the concept of just price that said a bartering is not sufficient. Price should reflect the cost of provision. Over time, that extended to the questions of non-discrimination in provision of service, access to service, and to this concept of status, of responsibility, of reciprocal responsibility, and the responsibility of the provider of the service. Now, there's been an expansion of public utility regulation over the ages, from Chief Justice Hale, who in the 1600s enunciated this concept of private goods made available if they're necessary, they come into the public domain. To the various forms of regulation, regulation by charter, regulation by legislation, by courts, and then finally administrative regulation, which as it grew in the progressive era and the New Deal era was the predominant form of regulation, seeking to attain social goals, social objectives over private objectives, seeking to maximize not merely private efficiency, but public efficiency as a whole. This has been the predominant form of regulation. And there was a period where it held firm, up until about the 70s, when there was the attack on regulation from the economic right, Chicago et al., and a movement towards deregulation. Now, Harry in his articles have done an excellent job in debunking both the theory and showing that deregulation has really not been effective. He continues to be a supporter, rightly so, of a regulatory approach that is social control of economic enterprise. And just as an aside, I put in the paper, if you're going to do that and do it well, there are certain things from Western ethical thought that are important, that deal with who we are, how it is we do things, what it is we really accomplish, and how it is we work well together. Virtue ethics, deontology, teleologically, and the concept of social contract. Harry, through time, has worked phenomenally well with all sorts of folks, from those his fledgling students of public utility courses to the seasoned professionals in regulation and elsewhere. Public utilities have existed a long, long period. And I would point out in closing, by his teachings, by his training programs and conferences organized a lot through his Institute of Public Utilities at Michigan State, and through his wealth of articles and edited volumes, he has demonstrated his rightful place among the leaders of institutional economics. The arc of utilities is long, and it will bend towards the public interest as long as there are those like Harry who bend it with the concept of with the view of the public utility concept in mind, a view that is fundamentally an ethical concept. Harry, we who were your fledgling students hail you, as well as those who are here, who are the seasoned professionals. Thank you.
Bill, are you going to need us to get your slides up?
No, you are.
Okay, Eric's going to try to get your slides up right now. Hold on 1 second.
Full screen view, share screen. All right. Just 1 second. You told me that the slides were on that stick.
I think, okay. Should say AFEE, that's him.
Okay. What I'm thinking I might do is, instead of doing these as a slideshow, what I will do is do this.
Will you be able to help him?
Oh yeah, I'll run the slides.
Okay, Eric's going to run your slides for you, so every once in a while you just got to tell him flip or new slide or something. Okay, Bill, it's all yours.
I'll rely on Eric to be paying sufficient attention to know when I move from one slide to the other, so I won't have to be giving instructions. I think it should be fairly obvious.
I don't know. You don't know me that well.
I began my career with Harry Trebing looking over my shoulder. And now in my retirement, I still have Harry Trebing looking over my shoulder. The only difference is that this time he has a cane in his hand and it can reach me. So I will do my best not to do him justice. My theme for today is institutionalizing the public interest in public utility regulation, Harry Trebing and the second wave of reform, for which he is the person principally responsible. An essential theme in that second wave I draw from one of Harry's publications. Regulation should not be a cloak for maintaining the status quo. Rather, successful regulation has a vested interest in maintaining flexibility and disequilibrium in the interest of encouraging innovation and change. This was in the late 1960s, where Harry, as the leader of an economic team at the Federal Communications Commission, engaged in research-based policy reform. And this was Trebing's announcement that an era of institutional reform of public utility regulation had begun. Moving to the next page, the first wave of institutional reform of the public utility industries was, as those who work in the field will know, associated with John R. Commons et al. At the turn of the 20th century. This was a response to gross market failure, monopolies and cartels, collusion, destructive competition, instabilities of supply and prices, extreme price discrimination, denial of essential services, and abuse of public rights-of-way. The result of the investigation of Commons and his colleagues was the establishment of a new institution, the Independent Public Utility Regulatory Authority, or Commission. First in Wisconsin and New York. Most states followed within a decade, and then federal regulators as interstate operations became more and more important. The essential mandates were always universal service at reasonable non-discriminatory prices and service quality. What was the performance then following the Commons establishment of regulation? In practice, the effectiveness of regulation varied among regulatory agencies and over time. Certainly better than no regulation, but well below the expectations. A conventional wisdom was developed, facilitated by academic, economic, and legal theorizing. Public utilities became known as natural monopolies because of large capital investment requirements in networks with continuing economies of scale. Universal service could only be achieved efficiently by monopoly. On the law side, regulation was the law's substitute for competition. So competition is not necessary and should not be encouraged lest it upset this delicate balance. What began as proactive advocacy of the public interest morphed into passive regulation focused on judicial fairness of process and substance. Continuous advocacy and lobbying by the utilities led to regulatory capture as a common experience. In a summary review of his long and detailed study of the evolution of utility regulation, Marver Bernstein concluded quite harshly, "The talent and energy we have devoted to designing regulatory programs to protect the regulated from unfair procedures and to minimize effects adverse to regulated clienteles must now be targeted on the modest problem of designing and improving systems of regulation that have a fighting chance of achieving some useful result." This then led to the second wave of institutional reform. This followed avenues of reform throughout the 1960s and 70s in which Harry was the instrumental player. The first question to be addressed was, did the experienced weaknesses of utility regulation show a need for structural reform of independent regulation? Or was it more a failure of internal institutional design of regulatory agencies to achieve the desired results? Evidence clearly showed it was failures of implementation. Beginning in the 1960s, Trebing took up the challenge of reforming the internal functioning of the Federal Communications Commission with respect to the leading policy issues of the time. The Trebing team demonstrated not only that regulatory effectiveness could be achieved, it could be path-breaking. Regulatory monopoly was the utility industry model of the time. AT&T was the largest company in the world, with dominance in telephone networks, services, equipment manufacturing, research, and development. The FCC regulated AT&T primarily by the process called continuing surveillance. That was closed negotiations, undertaken primarily over nice lunches. My first invitation to speak at the National Utility Regulators annual meeting came from AT&T, who I learned later was recruiting me for its stable of economists. At the FCC, after complaints by Western Union that AT&T was engaging on its monopoly, the telegraph business, Trebing was asked to provide some advice. He suggested a performance review of AT&T as the first performance review that would have taken place for 25 years. And Harry assembled the team. I was one of those he called on to join him to undertake this activity. And what we began was a series of research-based reforms on FCC substantive issues. One was, of course, cross-subsidies. The conventional wisdom was that AT&T was cross-subsidizing to make universal service possible. In fact, our research showed they were not. It was the Rural Electrification Administration that was subsidizing the rural areas, not AT&T. What we did discover, however, was that there were monopoly services that AT&T was earning excessive profits on and competitive services that they were suffering losses on. With regard to market entry, the natural monopoly claim should not be extended to the equipment or the network markets. Terminal equipment and specialized services competition was allowed. Some of you will remember this in the form of the Carter phone case of 1968 and the MCI case of 1969. Natural monopoly claims must be justified by market testing, not regulatory prohibitions. And the Trebing team took up the issue of the development of new technologies and some regulatory planning for the best regulatory arrangements to deal with the introduction of new technologies, specifically with regard to computers and satellites. The FCC's computer inquiry set a landmark in the ability for regulatory agencies to look ahead and prepare the ground for the development of new technologies. In addition to the research on the substance of the reforms, the Trebing team undertook research on the question of long-term planning and the structure of regulation. Namely, that long-term policy planning should be part of the regulator's activities. And the computer inquiry that I just mentioned was perhaps the best example, but it was also applied to the development of satellites as well. Changes also took place with respect to public interest advocacy in regulatory proceedings. This was initiated by the Trebing team and adopted formally by the FCC. Essentially, it began with the argument of AT&T that the Trebing team had specialized access to the regulatory commissions, and therefore its research should not be placed before the commissions unless it had been cross-examined by AT&T and other interests. We took up that challenge and put our research into proceedings to be cross-examined by AT&T and its army of lawyers and consultants. I have a particularly fond memory of that activity because as we were reaching that stage, Harry said to me, "Bill, why don't you handle that? I'm going off to Michigan State." And he ran off to Michigan State to establish the Public Utility Institute. And there I was, left alone to face AT&T's lawyers and Nobel Prize-winning economists. And I got to testify for 8 days. Thanks, Bob. I got to testify for 8 days in my first experience in this game. And what really turned the battle was that I was much younger than the AT&T attorney. And on the 8th day, he was getting a little confused and tired, so they finally gave up. But the important thing is that this set the principle for public interest advocacy as an essential part of these regulatory proceedings on important issues. Other commissions have adopted it, and many commissions throughout the country invite public interest advocacy from outside parties on important issues, and where you are, TURN in California has been a very effective advocacy of public interests over the years in the utility sector. And finally, Harry then took up the challenge of educating the regulators and the staffs of regulatory agencies, and many people will know the work of the Institute of Public Utilities, which has been training regulators now for several generations and continues to do so. Also, his advocacy of the establishment of the National Regulatory Research Institute, initially at Ohio State. It has now moved to Washington for the staffs of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. So research-based reforms to strengthen regulation through the NNRI, through Harry's time as the chief economist at the Postal Rate Commission to establish an effective advocacy there, and of course his publishing research and debate not only from his conferences, but on all of the issues of the day that attracted all interest and had a fundamental input in shaping developments, and as Rodney spoke of, his academic contributions across the public utility industries. For the post-reform experience, what we have seen is a period of effectiveness and then a period of decline. With the Reagan administration, after the breakup of AT&T, there was a change in conception about what deregulation was all about. It seemed that the change was, instead of deregulation using competition as a tool for regulation, it was deregulation should be no regulation, which was never what Harry meant. And Harry has been an effective participant in the debates on those issues. If we look at the renewed proactive advocacy of the public interest, it's been clearly been weakened. What the strength that was brought that limited industry lobbying, in a sense, has been lost to political influence, which has become much more powerful. Today, the FCC, for example, is struggling to implement universal broadband and network neutrality regulation. Its greatest claim is success in auctioning spectrum at prices that promote oligopoly concentration in mobile communication. Passive regulation focuses primarily on balancing the interests of the industry oligopolies. I recall that John Kenneth Galbraith, John Kenneth Galbraith and other institutionalists have emphasized the need for periodic renewal and reform if institutions are to remain dynamic and committed to their objectives. I think we have seen this in public utility regulation. As Commons before him, Trebing initiated and was a major driver of renewal and reform for the public utility industries in all of its dimensions. We are approaching a half-century since the Trebing era of renewal and reform. Complacency and rigor mortis are returning. Perhaps we are at the beginning of a new wave, a third wave of regulation. And with that third wave, hopefully it might come after the next election. And here Trebing has given us some guidelines as to what needs much greater research attention. The first is the tighter and tighter oligopolies that are developing in all the utility industry sectors. This is the new prevalent industry structure, and there is not effective regulation of it. And secondly, we need to explore and provide demonstrations that universal access to utility services can establish what he calls a higher level of resource efficiency than neoclassical theory calculates. When people are denied service on public utilities, that indeed is an inefficiency that must be included in the theory. For all his activities, we can only say, thanks, Harry. You've established the ground for a new generation to carry the public interest case forward. Thanks very much.
So our next speaker is David Gable, a tremendous basketball player from New England. And,
Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, all. I met Harry in 1978 when I was a staff member of the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities. After being with the commission for about 9 months, I was sent off to Lansing to the summer camp. And that was a great experience that continues to have an impact on how I view the world today. So in today's talk, I just want to mention a few ways that I benefited from his summer camp. The prior speakers have mentioned the summer camp, and I'm one of the students of that symposium. And so I just want to share with you, some of the things that I was exposed to and what I've learned from it. So first of all, the summer camp started off in the first week talking about how regulation works and what do we mean by the term rate base, price structure, price levels. And then in the second week, we started to critically evaluate different topics. And here, Harry's setup for the Institute was wonderful because Harry said for 2 weeks, we're going to get together academics, leaders in the regulatory community, and people who were new to the field like myself, and we're going to explore different topics. And there's going to be no one there from the industry, and there's going to be no shills from the industry. And that was terribly important because, as Bill referred to when he was recounting his experience in regulating the telephone industry, the Bell system did a wonderful job of recruiting academics who put forward certain messages that if you really wanted to be an economist, you had to think a certain way. And so one thing that I remember when I started in this field was, oh, he's really not an economist because he doesn't believe in Ramsey pricing or something like that. It's just, and Harry, on the other hand, at the Institute and in his writing said, first of all, there's big problems applying this theory. And he, along with his writings with Bill Melody, said, we start off with this Ramsey model that applies to a single commodity, and we're now trying to use it for a different purpose. We're trying to work with large aggregates, and there's all kinds of aggregation problems, both in terms of measuring marginal costs and demand elasticity. So that's one reason we should be reluctant to use Ramsey pricing to determine what's the revenue requirement of different baskets of goods. But the other thing that he conveyed during the summer camp was there are ethical issues here. Do we really want to use regulation to impose the biggest markup above marginal cost on the consumers who have the fewest alternatives available? And so to him, this was an ethical issue which just wasn't addressed at all by your standard neoclassical microeconomist. The standard microeconomist would just say, these are things which economists don't deal with. We don't really deal with welfare functions where we're concerned about the distribution of income. We just want to ignore that issue. And so Harry, through the summer camp, provided critical thinking and provided a framework for staff to challenge the mantra that was being promoted by the utilities. And the second thing that I remember from the summer camp was, for the first time, I heard on a regular basis discussion about the persistence of monopoly power. So I don't think I've ever heard that phrase before I went to the summer camp. And this reflected Harry's view as an institutionalist that, and here I quote, that institutionalist does not accept a transition to pervasive competition as inevitable or probable. So just because you eliminate a particular barrier to entry doesn't mean that we have a competitive outcome, that there is persistent market power. And so in the remainder of the talk, just as I think I finally understand what Harry was talking about back in 1977 when I first heard him use this phrase, I just want to illustrate what's meant by persistence of market power and why it's so important to keep this in mind by talking about the taxi industry and Uber. Now, the way in which the taxi industry has historically been operated in a place like San Francisco or Chicago, New York, or Boston is the city limited the number of yellow taxis that could drive the streets. And there were two reasons why the cities did this. One was to limit the amount of pollution in the central business district. And secondly, it was a great way to raise revenue. Because if you limited the number of taxis that could operate in the market, then people would pay for the right to be that supplier where you had a limited number of competitors. So entry was clearly impeded until there was this revolutionary technology, part of the gig economy that we talk about on a regular basis today. And that revolution, Uber, was an app which we could load onto our smartphones that said, hey, I'm leaving the Marriott Marquis and I want a taxi to be outside the door waiting for me. And I can make an appointment in advance and somebody's there who's ready to provide that service. And Uber connected consumers to a large number of competitors of the yellow cab. So in a place like New York City, there's 13,000 medallion cabs, and there's 50-some thousand Uber drivers in New York City. So we have 3 or 4 times as many Uber drivers as we do yellow medallion drivers. And so great experiment of how competitive markets operate, because let's run down the way in which this industry now works. You've had a substantial number of entrants. Instead of 13,000 yellow taxis, we now have 13,000 yellow taxis, plus 50,000 Uber drivers, plus in the last 2 or 3 years, the city has taken other steps to reduce entry barriers for cabs who want to operate outside of Manhattan, and also increase the number of livery drivers. So we have massive entry in an industry where there are essentially no fixed costs if you're an entrant. If you're an incumbent, you have a fixed cost. You have to buy the medallion. If you're an entrant, well, you already have your automobile. If I want to, I can go home. I have my automobile. I can start up my business. The entrant has practically no regulations that apply to them by the cities, which is unlike the incumbent. So the incumbents in New York City, for example, have to increasingly become handicap accessible taxis, and no similar requirement is imposed on the Uber drivers. And the yellow driver has to get a commercial license, commercial insurance. The Uber driver does not. So you have massive entry where the entrants clearly have lower operating costs than the incumbent. And so given this situation, let's add one more thing. Pricing. So the price of the yellow cabs is regulated by the municipality. And so the incumbent prices are sticky. They can't go down. So thinking back to the intellectual debates of the 70s that Bill talked about for a while and the theory of contestable markets, in that theory you had the incumbent having sticky prices. The entrant comes in with a price epsilon lower than the incumbent and is able to grab the entire market because the incumbent can't quickly react to the entrant. And all of those conditions are present in the travel industry, in the taxi business. And so do we see the disappearance of market power? Let me, before I go to the answer to that question, let's point out one more thing. When we had this debate in the 70s about deregulation and the persistence of market power, there was one industry that was supposed to be contestable. And the advocates of the theory of contestable markets pointed to the airline industry. And there was a beautiful article written about why the airline industry, which was capital on wings, no sunk cost, supposed to be contestable, why it ended up not being contestable. And the former president of People's Airlines wrote the reason why it wasn't contestable was there were sunk costs that we just weren't cognizant of when we thought about deregulating the airline industry, which in fact existed. And what the sunk costs were the costs of setting up business in a market and training the staff in a market. And furthermore, customers were tied to individual airlines through the loyalty program. So people weren't ready to quickly switch to People's Airlines because they didn't want to lose the mileage award that they got from Delta Airlines. But those conditions, or those attributes, sunk costs and loyalty programs, don't apply and exist in the transportation market. There are no loyalty programs offered by yellow cabs, so you could switch to Uber without giving up any mileage program, and there are no major sunk costs. Because as I said, tomorrow if I wanted to, I could go home and start driving for Uber, and I don't incur any substantial sunk costs if I decide to enter the business. Well, the answer is that despite these wonderful conditions, which are consistent with the theory of contestable markets, large-scale entry, no sunk costs, no fixed costs, no loyalty programs, we observe that there are still massive monopoly rents being earned in this industry many years after Uber was created. So Uber began operations arguably 2009 or 2011. In 2014, the peak price of a medallion in New York City was a bit over $1 million per medallion. So 3 years after large-scale entry, with all the attributes I've gone over, yellow cabs were still willing, or potential yellow cab drivers were still willing to pay $1 million for the right to be that monopolist who's driving a yellow cab. And today the price has declined. It's declined to $750,000 from $1 million. But if you do the math, 13,000 medallions times $750,000 per medallion, that's a capitalized $10.2 billion in monopoly profits that still exist just in New York City despite the ease of entry. So when I now reflect back on Harry saying, you got to understand, David, about the persistence of monopoly power, I've never understood it as well as I do today when I think about the taxi industry. Why is it that people are still willing to pay $750,000? What is it that separates Uber from the yellow cab? And the answer is this: you can hail a yellow cab, but you can't hail a Uber cab. That's illegal. And to me, that's also terribly instructive, just for two reasons. One, if you read the press, you always hear about how the gig economy is going to kill old institutions. And that hasn't happened here, and it's because there is this very small degree of product differentiation. One form of transportation requires scheduling through my smartphone, the other involves hailing a cab. And just that hailing a cab creates $10 billion worth of market power in New York City and illustrates the persistence of market power. So in conclusion, Bob tells me I have about a minute left. The three takeaways I have from this story is, one, is I never appreciated as much as I do now about how if goods aren't perfect substitute, there can be significant residual market power. Secondly, the story illustrates that the threat of entry doesn't eliminate economic profits, despite what advocates of deregulation have often proposed. And furthermore, we see that real competition isn't Cornell competition, but it's Stackelberg-type competition, where the entrance just serves the residual demand curve, and the incumbents just don't give up any part of the market. And finally, looking beyond utility regulation, one thing that struck me is that property taxes are often valued based upon what's the cost of providing the service using best technology. And as you see, the actual adaptation of the market of best technology is a long process, and it explains why there's a persistence of market power, and also suggests that when doing evaluation of an incumbent, it shouldn't be based on the assumption that the incumbent is constrained by the operating costs of the entrant. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry.
Okay, now we have Ken Rose. We're moving into electricity. He'll be an electrifying speaker, I guess.
Hello, Harry. I wish you were here. Well, my movement into this area and my acquaintance with Harry was rather late in my career, because like a lot of economists who got their PhD in the 1980s, I was schooled in probably more closely resembles the University of Chicago, thinking I went to Illinois, Chicago, and we had professors from there. And but my first job at a university happened to be at the National Regulatory Research Institute, headed by Douglas Jones, who's just a few feet in front of me, and he pretty much kicked all that out of me within a few years, and introduced me to the idea of the institutional school. And then a few years later, I ran into Harry at NARIC meetings and other places, and happily, he and I got to work together quite a bit at the Institute of Public Utilities at Michigan State. And I could say that the Institute at Michigan State is doing quite well still. We have many programs, and I'm proud and happy to be associated with the Institute that Harry started. He's very much present there. There's the Harry Trebing Library. That's right across the hall from the IPU offices there, where anybody can visit if you're interested. Harry donated many of his old papers that he cleaned out that make up the library, plus things that the director there now, Dr. Jan Beecher, has collected. And Doug even made a contribution of some of his material there, so I encourage you to use that. What Bob asked me to do here was maybe more of an applied version, I guess, of the institutional school. So what I'll do is just use some of the teachings of Harry and how they apply to a very current situation going on right now with RTOs, or regional transmission organizations. I understand not everybody's familiar with these new entities, so I'll try to describe them a little bit. But Harry had 5 major postulates that he called of the institutionalist model from a 1987 article, A Regulation of Industry and Institutionalist Approach. And I'm going to talk about 3 of the 5 here, but the first one was, this is a quote, "Industrialized societies give rise to concentrations of power, increased uncertainty, performance failures, uncompensated costs, and adverse distributional effects." And that, quote, "For many sectors, markets are not self-correcting and are incapable of assuring an adequate supply of goods and services at least cost." That's a pretty good summary of a lot of things we've heard already, so I don't have to elaborate on it. But there's one phrase in there that really jumped out at me. We're talking about how we're regulating these RTOs today, and that is the self-correcting process. They don't self-correct. We assume that they were, like a market, like a normal market would. Now, many markets that we don't regulate, they do self-correct, but not this one. This one has to be watched over by FERC and all the other participants in the market participants. So I'll apply it to that idea first. So just a little background on the RTOs, if you're not familiar with regional transmission organizations. They started out as just power pools, very simple power pool arrangements between regulated and vertically integrated utilities. One of the oldest ones is PJM, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland. That started way back in 1927. But over the last 20 years, they've really taken on a new role of being the wholesale market maker. They're the ones that make the energy market and run those markets. And PJM is the largest in the world, also the largest in the U.S., and that they now include 13 states and the District of Columbia, and 61 million people live under their rule. And it's over 837 gigawatt hours of energy in 2014. That's $50 billion in earnings. So this is a big, powerful economic interest now that I'd say most people don't even know exists, right? Most people aren't even aware that RTOs are around. There are several RTOs right now, the entire Northeast, the New England area, the New England ISO, the New York ISO. PJM, as I mentioned, is the biggest. One of them, the biggest in square feet, is the Mid-Continent ISO, or MISO. That now goes from the Canadian border all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico and cuts right through the middle of the country. We also have the Southwest Power Pool, Texas, which is not regulated by FERC. It's only regulated by the Texas Commission, and here in California is the California ISO. There are also a couple in Canada. If you come to the IPU programs, I'll explain to you what the difference between an ISO and an RTO is, but I don't have time to do that right now. So I'm just going to use the generic term of an RTO to refer to these big regional bodies now that are running the markets for wholesale power in the country. Now, it's important to point out these RTOs didn't evolve by design or government fiat, but they really developed, and their role has grown over time. They started out fairly simple as a way to coordinate between utilities and to do the dispatching of multiple utility systems. But then the markets came later, first the energy markets, the day-ahead markets, the FTR markets, the capacity markets, and all the others. And that takes usually, well, we spend 3 hours at IPU meeting talking about how these markets all fit together. So they've become very big, complex systems. And they have quite a bit of influence now, political influence even, because they've become so large. They're overseen by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, by FERC, and also they have independent, you can't see the quotes in my paper, but independent boards and committees. But it's really, the boards are made up of people that have a very strong economic interest in how and what the RTOs do. So I think it's fair to say that public input in these RTOs is peripheral at best. By the way, I forgot, my paper is posted online if you at the ASSA meeting, so you can read the whole thing in its entirety. But there's not much of a lot of public input, unfortunately, and that's a big problem from the Harry Trebing perspective and my own as well. So really, as the RTOs have grown and adapted to regulatory requirements and other perceived challenges, so as these markets have evolved over the last 20 years, they've been given new roles and new things to do. This includes multiple market structures that few can really understand. A common thing that I go to a lot of these meetings, and a lot of people, even who work for the RTO, can't explain everything that's going on. They're that complicated. Usually people are very adept at what it is that their particular area of expertise, but if they wander out of that, they're lost. And in fairness, it's because it's not simple, and it's also, it changes a lot. The operating agreements these RTOs are operating on are huge, hundreds and hundreds of pages. And the dumbest thing you could do is print the thing out, because by the time your printer got done printing it, it would be obsolete because they're changing the rules all the time. Now, I want to focus on one aspect of the RTOs, though, in this limited time that I have, which is that the capacity markets in particular. Capacity markets came later, after the energy markets and all the others had already developed. And in particular, what the problem was that the suppliers, particularly the suppliers, argued that they didn't have sufficient revenues from the energy market, from the ancillary services markets, and all these other markets, so they needed this additional capacity market. So these capacity markets were created. And I think really right now what we're seeing today, after these markets have been running, the PJM started back in 2007. Now we're seeing a new heightened urgency in trying to make sure that there's enough adequate capacity within these RTOs so that basically keep the lights on, right, so that they're able to operate. And so a number of power plants now, particularly coal plants, have announced that they're going to close and the RTOs are struggling with that as well. There's a number of reasons why they're closing. EPA rules is probably the one most people are familiar with, but there's also the intermittent power, or wind power in particular, is having an impact on the energy prices that the utility or the owners of those who are selling into the market are able to collect. So you have the prices basically being suppressed for just energy. It's important to understand that when we're talking about capacity market, that's over and above the energy and ancillary services. So we're talking about adding in on top of that. And so when you got more wind generation, we have coal plants shutting down, and also the low energy prices from natural gas that we have right now, the prices are lower. So now they're coming in saying we need more money. So a lot of the RTOs, what they've done now is have, quote, enhanced the capacity markets in order to basically generate more money. So what PJM did was they've got something they call the reliability pricing model, or RPM. They now call that capacity performance. That's the new product that they have, which generates more revenue for the suppliers in the market. Now, by the way, to be in this market, we're not talking about new capacity only. We're talking about existing capacity, in some cases already been supplied, for decades. It could still be, so we're talking about additional revenues to all capacity within the system. Now, PJM said that they believe that the RPM was successful, but it needed to change. It wasn't. Now, this is kind of interesting to me, because if you criticize PJM, say at a NARUC meeting or something, you get all kinds of scorn heaped upon you immediately. They don't like you to say anything bad about them. But they basically admitted that their old RPM capacity market was not working very well, and that they needed to change it. So the capacity performance now, we've had an auction. They had the first auction last August, and sure enough, not surprisingly, it generated more revenue for the suppliers. Now they're able to getting more money than they did under the old system. So it is working in the sense that it's creating more revenue. But what's pretty clear to me is what PJM is doing is they're not really setting up a market, a self-correcting market, as in the Harry's quote there. What they're doing is finding a way to get more revenue pushed toward the suppliers and hope that they do the right thing, right? That's really the whole purpose of the thing. So if market conditions change, energy prices change, either direction, then we're going to have to revisit the capacity market, because, the suppliers aren't likely to come in and say, I got enough, I don't need, I'll take less money. They'll, of course, only come in when they want more money, and it's never enough. So even now, and it's also important to point out, so now the utilities, or I keep saying utilities, but the suppliers, those in the RTOs, are also going to the states and asking for more money. So in Ohio and in Illinois, they're saying, well, the market conditions have turned against us. These are the same people that said that deregulation was wonderful back when the prices were real high. They said, oh, don't touch that. It's the workings of the free market. Now the market turned against them, and they said, no, I'm sorry, it isn't working out. You're going to have to, if you want a reliable system, you're going to have to fork over more money, which means more money coming from the suppliers. So what's happened? So we redesigned the capacity markets in a lot of these RTOs, generating more revenue. And it still seems to be not enough. They still are complaining that they don't have enough. From the customer's perspective, the costs continue to increase, with energy prices falling and remain relatively low since the late 2000s, right? You got energy prices going down, but electricity prices are going up in most of the country. And this seems to confirm Professor Trebing's first postulate, particularly that about the not being self-correcting, and assure an adequate supply of goods and services at least cost. I think this is a very good application of that. So what reforms are necessary to align the RTO's behavior with the Trebing public interest regulatory philosophy? Professor Trebing's fourth postulate is the strategies of actors in a regulatory process can have a significant impact on the outcome, and that success or failure of these strategies will be in direct proportion to the economic and political power that the participants can exercise. And there's no doubt in the case of the RTOs, we're talking about them being able to exercise considerable political power as they've been able to gain more and more power over time. It appears the RTOs could easily swing now from undercapacity to overcapacity positions, and wasting a lot of resources, costing customers a lot of money as a result of that, because of this fiction that this is somehow a market that we've created in this case. You know, what's interesting is that the RTOs really haven't even been serving the stakeholder interests very well. I think they're really starting to get to the point now where they're only really operating in the best interest of the RTOs themselves, not necessarily them. They've become an entity unto themselves, and they're not really operating, because the owners of the capacity are complaining they're still not getting enough. So you could argue they're not placating them, right? They're not keeping them happy. The only ones, I guess, who are happy are the RTOs themselves. By the way, if you ever get a chance to visit an RTO office, take them up on it. They're very impressive. You know, they'll put on a really good show for you. And again, you probably have absolutely no idea what's going on. I'm always amused by the legislators will get tours of PJM or MISO or one of those, and they'll get this grand tour, and they'll come out and say, oh, this wonderful market and all that. But, you know, I mean, come on, this is like, you know, a sturgeon being sucked into a nuclear-powered submarine, trying to comprehend what is happening. This is about the same sort of thing. That's about as close to a Harryism I can do.
There we go.
Oh, there you are.
So, in a 1984 essay, Professor Trebing also said, quoted another institutionalist, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, Horace M. Gray, and he quoted, or his take on him was, Gray argued that regulation involves a sharing of power between public and private authority, but such sharing is inherently unstable because private power will ultimately co-opt the public power. And this comes about because of the government's failure to apply its power. And this is, again, a very good illustration, I think, of that point, because what FERC has done is basically step back and said, okay, just, you know, do your thing, you know, we'll just provide oversight authority. And I think a lot of the problems that we're starting to see is because of them not really enforcing the authority that they could have. Harry's fifth and the final postulate that he had was that regulatory intervention may change over time, right? And clearly the RTOs evolved, but FERC is not. FERC is not really adapting to this. You know, the RTOs have already amassed considerable economic and political power, and as Professor Trebing warned, trying to reassert regulatory primacy once lost is difficult to retain. Well, I would say it's almost impossible, right? Barring a crisis or something that would do that. He was putting it politely back then. You know, perhaps FERC and now maybe probably legislators will realize that it's really not a good idea to have so much economic and political power concentrated in the hands of one large private interest that's not really being effectively regulated. And with that, I'll end. Thanks. Thanks, Harry.
Well, thank you. I'm going to talk about broadband industry planning and the public interest. But before I get there, a little bit about how I met Professor Trebing. I was at the University of Maryland, and Professor Grushi told me to start reading the JEI. So I read it, and I got a whole bunch of things going on, and then I came across a couple of articles that Harry wrote, and I said, okay, I'll apply to Michigan State and see if I can go there. And I got an assistantship with Harry for the summer, and I thought it would be really great, and we do all these, you know, I'd learn all this stuff. And what I was doing was driving Doug Jones to the airport and Bill Melody from the airport and picking up students from the bar around 2 in the morning. And so that was an assistantship with Harry Trebing, and where you learned about the real world. I have also a more recent story that was extremely unusual about Harry, in that just a couple of years ago, I was in a hearing room of the State Public Utility Commission. Prior to the start of the hearing, I was introduced to the general counsel of the utility. He said, "You're a Trebing student, aren't you?" And I said, yeah. And the way he spit those words out, I felt like I was doing some criminal activity. And then I realized that the name Trebing still struck fear into the heart of utility executives everywhere. So with that little introduction of our times together, I'll go to the theme, more mundane theme of my paper. Institutional economists have long recognized that many economic problems cannot be solved by the markets. Hey, big deal. We need social action to offset economic power and to guide market activities. Trebing suggested a long time ago that micro-specific planning was necessary, that industry regulation is needed even after the monopoly goes away, to offset the power of the duopoly or the tight-knit oligopoly that comes about when the monopoly sort of period is over. This vision and call for action is substantially different from the fairy tale gospels of the goodness of the market mechanism that, you know, many of us learned in graduate school and tried to forget. The Federal Communications Commission, though, has recently said it's got its own plan, okay? So the question of my paper is the plan of the FCC's like an institutionalist plan, or is it just like when you listen to the debates of the Republican candidates, each saying, I've got a plan for this or a plan for that? You know, is it really a legitimate plan? The FCC's plan has some very good goals. It wants to bring about 100 megabit service at an affordable level to 100 million homes. That's an outstanding goal in itself. It wants to bring 1 gigabit service to every school, hospital, and government building. So those are all very good goals that it has. The question that I'm going to address is, you know, will this plan meet the institutionalist goals of adequate service to meet emerging social values and a diffusion of power to allow the members of our society to enjoy the benefits of our shared technological progress? I will first talk a little bit about broadband in America and compare broadband in America to what's happening overseas. I will then evaluate the FCC's plan, and I will suggest a series of enhancements that are required to achieve the goals of the FCC. That sort of gives you a hint about whether or not the FCC's plan is really going to make it. Broadband service in America is essentially, it comes over various technologies. Most of us have, these cell phones and whatever. We think in terms of wireless, but if you really want high-speed connections, you're going to have to be dependent upon wireline. The wireless system originates and terminates the transmission or the communication, but it doesn't really transport. The transport is still all on wires. From when it hits the Wi-Fi router or the wireless tower, it is all wireline after that. So it's only wireless from you to the first next spot where it's transmitted. Now, in the United States, high-speed transmission has been dominated by the cable industry. They made a very significant change in their technologies from about 1996 to 2004. There used to be one-way analog systems with a lot of analog amplifiers that couldn't do two-way voice, that couldn't do high-speed data. Okay, so what they did was they yanked out all of the amplifiers, they yanked out a whole bunch of their coaxial and put in fiber to a coaxial node, and that combination allows them to dominate the broadband market today. They have approximately 58% of the wireline market, and 73% of the high-speed wireline market is now the cable industry. The telephone industry provides high speed through fiber. We have things like Verizon Fios, AT&T Gigapower, and Google. But one of the things that you might not know is that about now they passed 10,000 homes with fiber, but in the mid-1990s they promised by 2000 to pass about 50 million homes. So they're very far away from their promises to bring fiber to America. To compare to the United States and Europe, you can compare along different things like high-speed service availability, broadband serviceability, subscription rates, actual download speeds as against advertised speeds, and prices. The United States does lead in the availability of high speed. Between the cable and the fiber, the United States has approximately 80% of the households have the ability to have this service pass their house. The European advanced networks are only around 50 or 60%. For basic broadband, just to get anything on broadband, both Europe and the United States are well over 90%. But here's where we start sliding. On a subscription rate basis, the United States is in the middle of the pack, 16th out of 34 countries. We're 26th out of 38 on the basis of actual download speeds. So we have a better network, but we aren't using it. And the question is why? Well, one of the reasons is maybe it's price. Nobody can afford to buy this high-speed network. So it's really difficult to compare prices because you don't know what's in the bundle. So you've got various bundles that you're buying, and different, whether you're looking at purchase power parity or exchange rates. So there is there's a difficulty when you compare price, but and this is an FCC report, the United States price for triple play is the 31st highest out of the 34 countries that we're looking at. And for double play, which is just data and voice, the United States price is 33rd highest out of 35 that the FCC looked at. So we have these high prices. So that's the background of the industry that we're looking at. So what's happening? What's the FCC trying to do? Okay, it is essentially focusing on the large price cap companies. These are the companies that used to be Bell operating companies. The companies that took the money and ran instead of investing in their networks. They bought other networks. They merged. They paid a lot of money to control the wireless spectrum. And instead of investing in their rural and high-cost areas, they did these other things, like buying each other up and having a nice party. So the FCC, in order to offset those kinds of activities, is now wanting to give them some money. And in the first round of this, it actually gives the companies money to invest. And they have a certain social obligation as far as how fast the service can be in terms of megabits. Okay. In that kind of grant, there's two rounds of the grants. In the first round of the grant, only $115 million was accepted out of a $300 million offer. In the second round of the grant, $385 was accepted out of $485 offered. What was the difference? Well, in the first round, Verizon and AT&T took nothing. In the second round, Verizon still took nothing, but AT&T took $100 million. Why? We went to, instead of the regulator making sure that the social obligation was met, to self-certification. So now you get, like, would you like to grade your own prelim or bar exam? Well, that's the regulation we have now covering the investment in broadband. And so AT&T, once this happened, said, sure, I'll take the money. Okay? Then in phase two, in the process that is just rolling out now, the FCC gives you revenue equal to the difference between your cost of service as measured by a formal economic engineering model and your expected revenue per customer, okay? So the expected revenue is $52. Cost might be $152, so you get $100 per month to serve this customer, okay? And another thing that happened was that the FCC had a budget constraint, so a lot of the very high areas, very expensive high-cost areas, aren't getting any money at all. So we're just focusing on high-cost but not so high-cost areas, okay? And they're the ones getting support today. Along with the support, you had to meet certain requirements. You had to provide voice service. You have to provide a minimum transmission speed of 10 megabits in the downward direction. You must have a bundle of at least 100 gigabits per month. And think about what that means. That kicks out the wireless industry. Because if you buy 100 gigabits per month from your wireless carrier, it's about $800. Okay, so that cannot be affordable service. So by keeping this 100 gigabits in the universal service basket, you're essentially saying you have to use the wireline business to provide universal broadband service. So what happened? The carriers accepted, they didn't have to take it, but they accepted $1.5 billion a year for 3.6 million locations. Okay? Well, that's only 3% of 152 million locations that these carriers serve. So the FCC hasn't done diddly squat for 98% of American consumers. The FCC then said, the other thing that they said was that the rate for the service in the rural area has to be comparable to the rate for the service in the urban area that is not supported. Okay, so that's the plan. That's what they're doing. So what are some of the problems? Well, the first thing is obvious. They didn't address market power. They didn't address the fact that the cable industry and maybe one other person is providing you the service. The public service obligation, second, does not match its the FCC's broadband service goals. Third, the plan is insufficiently funded, so you can't get enough done. Fourth, it's taxing a contribution base that is too small. And fifth, it switches from calculated support to undefined and inappropriate bidding process at the end of a 6-year period. Because the FCC ignores the market power, 98% of Americans aren't helped at all by this plan because there's nobody coming to help them. I tried to measure how concentrated this industry was, so I looked at the NTIA had some data on broadband service in the United States. So we looked at 2,766 counties, and I formed a Herfindahl index of availability, which actually gives benefit to major providers. So that's a more detailed argument to say that. But I only found 48 counties that had Herfindahl indexes in a competitive range. And even then, it's problematic because if Time Warner and Comcast serve the same county, they'll never compete. So my market is sort of too wide, and the 48 might not, is probably too high a number for the number of counties that have competitive markets. It even gets worse as the speed gets faster. Only 12% of Americans have 3 or more choices for 25 megabit service, and for most of us, for 45% of Americans, for 25 megabit service, they only have one provider, and that's generally the cable company. Okay? So you have this huge concentration. Second, the FCC has now defined advanced telecommunication service at 25 megabit service, but it's only saying that you have a public responsibility of 10 megabit. So it's allowing people to build networks that are less than what they think is the appropriate service speed, and not doing anything about it. The $4.5 billion total budget that the FCC says is much below what the FCC's own original research said was needed to provide broadband in America of $23 billion, and much below what the industry came in, because they got scared of the $23 billion, the industry came in and said about $10 billion. So 4.5 is half of what the industry thinks, and the industry came in with that, what they considered a low number, in order to try to keep things in bounds and keep the subsidies low. So now I'll skip a couple of the arguments, but I want to get to what happens at the end of 6 years. Because the FCC promises the support, revenue minus your benchmark, for a monthly basis for each line for a 6-year period. At the end of the 6 years, the FCC believes that it could have a competitive bidding process to get the subsidy after 6 years. I think for a second, you've now subsidized one player for 6 years. That player has a network out there. Nobody else is around. How are you going to get another bidder? So why have the stopping point at 6 years? It makes no sense. So how can we enhance this system? Well, first we have to get more competitors out there. There's 2 ways to do that. One is to reserve a certain amount of the universal service funds for municipal broadband. That way cities and towns can come into the FCC or to their state regulators and say, look, we want to build our own system, help us build it, and we'll have another competitor. The second way to get more competitors in is, now that the broadband transmission service is a Title II service, you can say, we want that to be a wholesale service, so that the cable and the telephone people must both provide a wholesale service. You can figure that price out real easy from the FCC's economic model. It'll probably be somewhere around $25 in an urban area, so that a competitor can come in, buy the wholesale product, add its own ISP services and transmission services on top of that, and compete. So those are the 2 ways in which you can add competition to it. In the rural areas where you'll never get any competition, you can extend the time period of the subsidy with the obligation that you have a fiber-to-the-home network, so that that network will meet the long-term obligations of the FCC to give you 100 megabit service. So you have something where you know that you won't be able to get competition out in the rural areas, and you have the network built that will meet your long-term goal. So in conclusion, it is necessary to enhance the FCC's broadband plan in order to meet its goal of providing affordable, high-speed broadband service. To provide affordable service in urban areas, it is necessary to recognize that maintaining competitive markets requires regulatory action. To bring high speed to the rural areas, it it is necessary to establish incentives that lead providers to engineer their networks to the long-term goals. Through these enhancements, the public interest goals of higher levels of efficiencies, universal service, and the lowest possible prices consistent with internalizing of social goals will be attained. And thank you. I guess, what time is it now?
It is 2:06.
2:06. Harry, are you still awake? Do you want to say anything? Or, just okay. That's all right. So we're open to questions or comments.
I'm just curious, I think everyone first mentioned the wind industry, the internet power. Southern New Mexico, we have a similar thing with solar power, where the companies are now going to their agencies and money to change the rate structure because they can't really want to generate to sell electricity while the sun's out. They don't want the lights to go out at night, so they want to hook up to the grid. Of course, the grid costs money just to exist, and everything. And I just don't know quite what opinion to have. I'm not sort of sympathetic to the company's request, but I don't know whether that's company open or whether it's a true issue.
To some extent, I was talking about the wind generation, particularly the wholesale market. And New Mexico is not in an RTO, but in where there are RTOs, what's happening is the wholesale price for energy is being suppressed because of the wind generation. Wind gets the subsidies and all that, so they'll bid in at zero. And even if the LMP price goes to negative, they still generate power. So the question about is it a legitimate issue? Yes, I guess to some extent, at least in these RTOs, and it's not really clear. I mean, the economist solution would be get rid of the subsidies, because then they'll bid in more, they're more likely to bid in cost than they would otherwise. So I think that would probably help. They give the subsidies because obviously they want to encourage renewables. So but I think there's a convergence of a whole bunch of things where we're going to have to probably take a bigger look, because the whole point is to reduce emissions, right? And subsidizing solar or wind may not be the best way to reduce the emissions. I think we're going to have to take a more comprehensive look. It's hard for me to answer that question.
Well, the issue is, they argue is that mostly households, people are buying their own house with solar on their roof.
I think what you're talking about is the net metering.
Yeah,
The net metering is affecting utilities now, because what the net meterer is getting, they're getting compensated at the price that they pay for electricity. It's the full retail price. And the utilities point out, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because they're using all these network services at night and all that. And I think what happened with net metering, and what's happening is, when it was just a handful of utilities just kind of passed it off. It was easier to have net metering and just let the thing go. But I think what's happening now is utilities have been convincing legislators and commissions that basically subsidizing the full cost of the retail rate doesn't make sense. At least have a reduced amount, so they still get paid for what they sell, but it ought to be basically what they're paying, what they're selling in terms of generation costs, not the full retail price, which includes distribution, transmission, and all the other things.
Right. People who can afford this.
Right. Okay, that's another. And in California, this has really been a big issue, because they've got this declining block or increasing block rate. So the customers that are using a lot of power at the real high price, they're the ones with the highest incentive to put rooftop solar on, and they're getting compensated at that high rate. So, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't think anybody agrees.
One of the things that's happening in Wisconsin and a lot of other states is that the utilities are increasing the fixed rate, the customer charge. And they're doing it with an argument of fairness. They're saying, well, it's really the customers who are getting access to the distribution company. They should all share in the cost. equally. This goes back to what the local telephone rate issues were, back when there were local telephone costs. And what that does is to shift the responsibility for paying to the distribution systems to the smaller users and oftentimes the poorer users, because their rates are going up. There's no savings that's really coming in terms of the energy charge, which is basically the.
And the other thing with it is that the retail price that you pay doesn't consider the fact that during the daytime when the sun is shining is when the price to the utility is highest. So you're actually giving them electricity. The energy charge should be below the energy charge in the market. And at night, when you are buying, you're paying more than what the company is paying for electricity. So you also have that interacting with the fact that the grid has got the network distribution costs are not being paid by a person who is not using electricity. So there's a bunch of interacting factors. Those that Rodney said, there's a bunch of things, and so far none of us have come up with a really good answer to your question.
Other than it's probably not a good idea to be doing it at a full retail price, it doesn't make sense. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. The other part of your question, though, about is there some merit to what the utilities are arguing? I think there is some, but now you're seeing like Edison Electric Institute saying, well, there's a death spiral, and it's going to drive the utility. It'll be a long way off. I think a lot of things will happen long before that. These distributional effects that Rodney's talking about are probably more immediate than a death spiral.
That's what they seem to be basing their arguments on.
I think they're getting the utilities starting to get some sympathy with legislators now, so they see some changes in the compensation.
Well, I think Rodney's cost of service in Wisconsin went up substantially.
Is one of them.
Yeah.
Of course, what David said is that they'll never. The dominant servers, the utility companies, electric companies, they'll never do it. They'll do very well.
Do you have any more questions?
I was gonna, on the issue of high-speed internet and internet services, I didn't know if anybody had heard of the town of Salisbury. I live in Salisbury, North Carolina, and the city actually asked, we have several very progressive people trying to promote local business on the city council, and so they tried to get AT&T, Comcast, other companies to provide high-speed internet for the city, and they all denied or demurred. They decided not to do it. So Salisbury put out a bond and built their own high-speed internet, and so now I guess we're a gig city. But one of the interesting details about that is that we created a bond. It was a $20 million bond in order to finance it. And the North Carolina legislature, under pressure from the cable companies, passed a bill that said you cannot use bonds without having a referendum if it's going to be for Ethernet or utility services.
Well, immediately,
After the fact, they shut down any other city from doing it. We've been very successful, but they now have come in. We announced this past fall that we were providing, I don't know the speeds, so whatever the great speed would be, like 10 gig or 1 gig city or whatever, and AT&T announced that they were going to provide comparable service. They were going to come into Salisbury and compete only in the city of Salisbury. We're limited to the city of Salisbury alone, but they decided to.
A comment on that is that the FCC has an order out. It's not the most, but it has said that state legislators.
You're all looking at me. I can see you, but I can't hear you.
Uh-oh. Eric, what happened? No, you can't hear us.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you?
Hey, Evan, can you hear this? Bill?
I can't hear you.
All right.
Sorry, it sounds like
Just lost the sound.
Okay. I mean, if your paper is heavy enough to do
Well, anyhow, there's a partial answer
Oh, no, it's fine. It's I have a good question to ask them.
Well, ask it, Bill. He can't hear us.
They will be chased out of the room.
Anybody know American Sign Language, you know? Just say, Bill, talk. Where's the...
Go ahead. Okay, hope I'm speaking to someone. In the comparisons that Bob Loeb did, where the U.S. was ranked 33rd and 34th and 35th, I'm now working in a country that's ranked 3rd or 4th. In Europe, a colleague and I recently edited a book of studies of how all the different European countries were achieving the European objectives with regard to broadband rollout. And the big difference I notice here, and I must say I also notice the same thing with regard to the development of green energy sources like windmills, that the big difference between the U.S. and Europe is in the U.S. the public sector is much more active in these activities. Municipal operations, both big cities and small, are building fiber and then leasing it to whoever wants to supply services over it. The same in the energy industry. You see greater activity by municipal companies, by municipal governments, by regional governments within countries, and by national countries, and by national countries in promoting these developments. And that may be the reason they are ranked much higher than the U.S. I'd be interested in comments from anyone. Thanks.
Well, I've noticed a similar thing when I was doing district heating analysis in that when the distribution company was, when the municipality was in charge of local heat and electricity, you got combined heat and power all over Europe. In England, where you have a separate electric and a separate national gas company, you don't have combined heat and power.
This is what you get from tight oligopolies. They cut you off before you can discuss the problems they're creating.
Did he hear you?
He didn't hear me. I heard him. Go ahead, Richard.
But part of this, okay, and I was a student of Bill's, and I went to Camp Heritage, and I want to invoke something that Harris said. I heard him say several times when he was speaking to the regulators and narrative. In his closing statement, it would always be, it's time to take the bull by the tail and look the situation squarely in the face. That's exactly what the situation is with broadband. Even before what happened in Salisbury, AT&T, especially, and Comcast had national lobbying programs to curtail any efforts to get municipalities involved.
I have been informed there's nothing we can do here to fix this problem. We think the problem is you. What's that say? Huh? Yeah.
There has to be utilities that says the community services district can build broadband, but if you build it and a private person wants it, you are required to sell it. So That's.
I can't hear you, but I know I can say hello to, I see Doug sitting there. And is that you, Regina?
Yes.
Okay. The young lady you will see sitting in about the fourth row is the granddaughter of a granddaughter of the Trebing movement. She was a student of mine, and I was a student of Harry's, and I don't know whether she has any of her students there or not.
Thank you, Bill.
I think, so I just say we give up. Yeah. Okay. We've given up, so don't wait for the connection at this end. Okay. Hang on. Say whatever you want to say.
Oh, this is Harry Trebing. I must say, this has been a delightful afternoon. I've been greatly impressed by what has been said. I'm very optimistic that in the future we're going to do a great job in keeping up the work that was started so well in the past, and we're resting in our hands of wonderful people. All of you, keep up the work. You're needed. The future will rest with you. Thank you so much for being so nice. Bye-bye.
Bill, can you hear me now? No? Okay. I only have two.
We're now going to have a drink.
Bill, can you hear me now? Can you hear me? No. No. Okay. All right, well. You want to announce what we have drinks, as well. There's going to be the presidential address, just, for our memory here. Fred Lee, is, the president in memoriam. He's going to be having, an address, delivered by Toddy Joe in this room, Pacific H, at 4:45. We have one more session before that. And after that, there's a cocktail party in Pacific I.
Regina.
Hello. Yes. There's a power check right in there. Okay.
Hi, how's it going?
Oh.
That well.
Yeah.
No,